Welcome to Better Leaders, the podcast, where we surface good leadership and smart management in media and beyond. Today, I'm talking to Lisa Gibbs, VP of Philanthropic Development at the Associated Press. My name is Anita Zielina, and I'm your host. Welcome to Better Leaders. Lisa, thank you so much for joining us today in Better Leaders, the podcast. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So why don't we get started for our audience members who might not know you and what you're doing now and your career so far? Why don't you give us a brief kind of spiel of what is your current role and what brought you to that role?
Great. Well, I work for the Associated Press, and I am right now their Vice President for Philanthropic Development. And my career has taken a bit of an unusual arc. For many years, I pretty much had the career of a traditional journalist, particularly focused on business news. So, reporter, editor, manager, leader. I joined AP in 2014 as their global business news editor. While I was there, I ended up overseeing AP's first large-scale experimentation with automation and artificial intelligence, where we began automating the production of corporate earnings stories. And that led me down a path of beginning to really explore and understand how news organizations can better leverage technology for the good of the journalism. And I, got to know a lot more than I ever thought I would about, artificial intelligence, but also news operations and what it means to bring change to a newsroom that was used to doing things a certain way. And as part of that, I started seeing how collaborations in general could really strengthen a newsroom and bring in skills and resources to organizations that are often financially stretched. And that then led to me creating, working with my managers to create a role for myself in exploring how we could do more partnering around the entire global news organization and what might a real partnership strategy look like. And that could be collaborations with other news organizations to produce great journalism, but it could also be collaborations with tech startups or universities. And we really thought very broadly about the role that collaborating could play in strengthening journalism. And it turned out that philanthropies really are excited about that too and like to fund those sorts of projects. And as philanthropies in the last few years, particularly in the United States, have become more aware of the importance of journalism to society, they have really increased their support of news. And, we benefited from that. And I found myself in kind of an interesting intersectional place where I'm now able to kind of develop really interesting journalism projects and then go find the funding to support them.
There are quite a few things that I love about that career path and that I think are going to be particularly interesting for the folks listening to this conversation. Because one thing that you said that I immediately want to kind of jump on and talk about is, so I created this job with my managers. So let's talk about that a little bit. Is that a thing in your career that you create your own jobs?
It has turned out to be. And it's funny or interesting that you raise this because I think the most common question I get from people who are looking for leadership advice or mentoring is, how did you figure out how to do things outside the traditional journalism path? In ways that make sense. And I think that there is a real hunger for doing just that. think cross-functionally. It's interesting. I think that, of course, for many years, I was not doing that. I had very traditional roles. I think I was always kind of looking for, I was kind of treating what I was doing as a bit of a chessboard and seeing players, who, all kind of could fit together in some new ways. And always trying to figure out how to do new things within the confines of my existing role. And I think that, as I got better at doing that and there was a greater understanding of the value of that, I was able to kind of make the case that, here's how our organization will benefit if I'm allowed to spend more time doing that and really owning that. But I'm not going to say that there's not quite a bit of luck in that, because I think it also requires leaders above you to really appreciate, that and the importance of it.
But I think I can totally relate. I mean, I never had a job after my very first kind of jobs interning or as a young journalist, I never really had a job that existed before I had it. So I always got to, which I guess is a very lucky thing, to kind of shape those roles. And I found it super intriguing and amazing and a big gift to be able to do that. But I also have to say that it's quite stressful because you're basically usually in an existing organization, a legacy organization. And there you go, mostly as, a person coming in and doing a job that hasn't existed before. So I always found there is quite a lot of explaining to do. Do you find the same thing?
1,000%. A lot of my time is spent on explaining and educating. I mean, one of the things I think about a lot, I have often described what I do as operating a startup within a 177-year-old news organization. And when I think about what actual entrepreneurs do who are really building something from scratch, and I mean, for me, they are the heroes, right? I mean, to take those kinds of risks without a real safety net. Whereas, who am I? I'm taking risks, but with, a big, a news family around me and a safety net to fall back on. But of course, there are some unique challenges to trying to do new things within the context of a large organization that certainly has its own ways of doing things, history, if never been done before, barriers and all of that. And I think I have come to realize that it is actually a skill of mine navigating large organizations to be able to make change in a way that's a little bit different from going out and running a startup.
Yeah. And it's an amazing skill that gets you far if you work in large organizations, and that many people, I think, don't have naturally. I think it's something you can obviously learn, but I think you bringing that passion for that kind of navigating the system element probably really helped kind of shape your own roles. Are there any things that you can, as you reflect back on that and what you learned about that system navigation, stakeholder management, what are some things that you learned about that?
Well, I mean, lots of things. I mean, when I think about how I have gotten things done, and you touched on it with, the idea of, educating, whether you are trying to make change within a defined department or whether you're trying to, bring a whole new capability to a large organization, really defining the vision and helping people understand the vision and what you're trying to achieve is, just kind of the foundation of being able to do the work. And so there is a lot of explaining and, helping people understand the why and the value of why. And, having to, for the first 4 years in my role, I was a team of one.
Yeah.
And so I really had to influence and persuade people to help me with the things I wanted to get done by showing them this is why, this is what you will get and what AP will get, from doing this work. And so, bringing people along with the vision, is critical. And I think that I also learned even more to not be put off by barriers and resistance. You just have to let that roll off and not get discouraged. And it would be very easy to kind of say, well, no one wants to do this. No one, this is just not something that anyone wants to give the time for and do. And I think that I always had a little bit of that persistent quality, but I think I've also really come to understand that when people surface questions or are initially skeptical about an idea, or they like the idea but can't imagine how anyone would find the time to do it, like that's the start of, like, that's not a no,
Yeah.
That's just the start. And, really learning to kind of build up my own resistance to getting discouraged or thinking of that as a deterrent. Like, no, like that's just part of the process. That just means we have to continue to explain. We might have to bring more people in. Maybe we might, have to try another team, but like no is really just the opening.
Yeah. And I think that's a totally interesting kind of mindset change, because I don't think it's usually how you operate if you work in a large team, because that would mean like multiple stakeholder management like all the time. So I find that really intriguing. I think it's a very entrepreneurial aspect of your job, which has a lot of entrepreneurial aspects, right?
It does. And as you said earlier, it can be quite tiring. I mean, it does take a lot of energy. And, I remember, especially at the beginning, thinking, can I just go back to running the journalism, which, we produce the story and it goes out into the world and then you move on to the next story. And this is a very different kind of work.
Yeah.
You're always kind of working on creating it, growing it, nurturing it, measuring it, and to be clear, like I definitely don't want to suggest that there was any sort of broad resistance to what I think people were genuinely excited to try new things and, be a part of innovation and something different. I think the challenge becomes helping them figure out how to fit that into the 50 things they've already got to do today and make the space for it.
Absolutely. So resistance is not always kind of that curmudgeon kind of, we don't want to do it. It's sometimes just people's resources are strained, right?
Definitely. I actually think that's far more common.
Yeah.
That's the reason.
Yeah.
Rather than the curmudgeon. So.
Yeah. When you entered that new phase of your career and started that new role, did you perceive kind of an initial like loss of power or influence by not, immediately again having a large team and having a very clear kind of power center in the organization and the industry?
I would say yes. It was an adjustment. There's also, kind of wrapped up in that is a little bit of the, like, I've got to really explain, if you're a global business editor, I run a team of 60 journalists covering finance. And, it's an easy explanation.
Yeah.
He understands what that is. But the first title of director of news partnerships, well, what is that? And I even had former staffers say to me, they thought I was crazy for taking on something that was so like unknown and, not really understood. And, so yes. And I think that, along with it comes the feeling of being an island a little bit, where, not only like you're creating something new, but you have to find your advisors in slightly different ways.
Yeah.
There's not people that have gone before you who you can really say, help me work through this problem. Like, you have to think a little bit more creatively about, how you approach getting that advice and mentorship. So, going to AP's head of strategy, or, that sort of thing, was kind of critical to me feeling like I had a community of advisors.
Yeah. I can totally imagine, because I do feel one of the things when I reflect on a lot of the conversations I had with folks having those newish, often very interdisciplinary, often very kind of collaborative roles that somewhere, that sit somewhere at this intersection, that we talk about so often, of like business, editorial, strategy, operations, marketing, tech. Often it feels even lonelier than leadership roles in kind of the legacy tracks of organizations feel like, because you often are the one person in your organization doing that kind of job. So it kind of becomes so important to build those networks and alliances like outside of work as well. And I know you're someone who's like super well connected and spends a lot of time collaborating with others outside of the organization. So I bet that's something that you invest a lot of time and energy in as well.
I do. And I will tell you that earlier in my career, I had the experience of working as a journalist from home when my children were young. And doing that, I think in a lot of ways actually prepared me well for this current role, because when you're working, pre-COVID, when people didn't talk about working remotely, I did. And if I didn't build my own peer network and, internal network, like I was really not going to make it.
Yeah.
And I learned about the importance of actually investing time in those relationships,
Yeah.
and outside organizations and things like that, which have now helped me in this current role. I do think so. I think it's absolutely true that there can be a loneliness factor in what you're talking about. But I will say I loved it immediately. I loved the chance to have such a wide variety of projects that I was working on, which might involve particular journalism teams, but also might involve AI products or data journalism, or, there was a really diverse set of opportunities for building partnerships. And that was really thrilling to me. And at the beginning, I will also say, I think the flip side to the loneliness part is that you also can kind of do a lot under the radar and, fly under the, and people don't quite realizing.
Yeah. It gives you some freedom that you don't have if you're in a totally like pre-structured setting, right?
Yes, and I do well in that setting when I'm kind of quietly, making deals. And the game changes when suddenly it reaches this tipping point where, wait, she's bringing in how much money? And now the attention is focused, which is wonderful, but it changes the dynamic.
It does, because suddenly, there is attention, right? So the first 2 or 3 years, you have that luxury to play a little bit because there isn't that much attention. And then obviously when you're successful, it suddenly kind of becomes a thing, right? Because that's, I think, what happens with successful startups, successful initiatives, and so forth. There is suddenly managerial attention, which is great on one hand, but we all know that also comes with scrutiny on the other hand.
Definitely. But, I feel very fortunate because I was given the opportunity to really do something that was different and previously unexplored, and was able to kind of play around in the sandbox for a good few years. And fortunately, there were successes. And now I'm, getting a lot of support to really build on that foundation and make it something even better. So it's exciting.
So you touched on some things in the last answer, like, the COVID pandemic and what it did to the way we work and like hybrid or remote work and collaborative work. So I want to talk a little bit about that because one of the things that I find so intriguing about your role and the way you're living it is that it's purely built on collaboration, and obviously also collaboration with folks all over the United States in all kinds of organizations. I bet also outside of the United States. So I guess your work is mostly asynchronous, remote, hybrid in whatever way. I bet that's also something relatively new for a legacy media organization, right?
Yes, definitely. I think that when COVID first hit, like every organization, we were challenged by having to essentially convert what felt like overnight into a remote operation. And thinking about what it takes to move a global news agency that's shooting live in the field and, all of that kind of stuff to, remote production. It's kind of amazing that we did do it and it worked for the most part. And really, I think it was so successful. Today we're only back in the office 2 days a week, which is really a testament to the success of remote work.
Yeah.
For me, you're absolutely right that even when I'm in the office, my focus is often outside the office, whether I'm meeting with AP journalists, around the world or speaking with partner organizations. It is very much about, as you said, that kind of external work and figuring out the right ways to collaborate and get things done via Zoom and shared documents and, Slack and all of that kind of stuff.
And it seems you very early on, like you mentioned before, had a knack for that kind of independence. How do your colleagues, and not just necessarily at the AP, but like people in the journalism space, how do you feel that whole hybrid new work question is impacting the industry on a broader scale?
I'm curious what you think about this as well. I see so many different kinds of challenges being discussed. And of course, it depends. If you're a news team, the requirements are much different, right? And the dynamics are much different versus a team like mine, which is doing project-based work that doesn't necessarily have to be completed with urgency and all of that. For my own part, I can say that I think I do need to remind myself that there is enormous value in sitting across the table from even the, even the people that you speak to every day on Zoom and Slack, having those touch points where you are bringing everyone together in one space to talk to each other. It's incredible, but although it shouldn't be, how much that changes the dynamic of the conversation.
Absolutely.
Really allows for more free-flowing brainstorming. I think it's that we lose with all of the Zooms and the Slacks is the kind of the flaring, free-flowing.
The flaring. I like that sentiment because I do think. So I'm like, personally, I'm a super big fan of that whole asynchronous, remote, hybrid, or more remote than hybrid setting, because I could, my work is so global. I could not, if it involved traveling to every client, every partner, I would spend my life on planes. So I'm super grateful for the opportunity to do most of that work remote. But I do realize and recognize that specifically for folks who are earlier in their career, there is something about getting to know how an organization, an office, a newsroom, an entity works together. That a lot of the relationships you build are being built, at the water cooler or outside when you're having a drink with your team or kind of between meetings. And the thing that obviously online work does is it makes online meetings so transactional. We rarely have online meetings that are just, let's talk about how things are going, right? We are okay, we have 30 minutes. This is what we need to get done. Okay, bye. See you all next week. And I think that's hard for both people who haven't had the chance and opportunity and gift to be able to build that network in an in-person setting. But I think it's also sometimes hard for organizations to accept that this requires an entirely new way of managing performance and, living leadership and living management. So what I do see is a bit of a culture clash happening at the moment, where legacy organizations sometimes fail to recognize that folks are not going to be coming back 5 days a week. It's just not going to happen. Folks are going to quit if you force them. Not all of them, but many of them. And on the other hand, I do see that by just doing online and being like, oh, cool, we can save the money for an office, that doesn't mean that you're deliberately building a culture.
I think we're still really wrestling all of these issues. And I think for companies that believe there needs to be some consistency around policies and what we allow and don't allow, I think that is really being challenged by the understanding that it really does matter what kind of work you're doing in terms of what cadence and type of work is.
Yeah.
I mean, this is a little bit of a tangent, but I think a little bit about, the notion of when I was business editor, or really, any editor is always like telling their reporters to get away from the desk and go out and actually talk to people and, feet on the street. And so, in some ways it's like, I don't want to see you in the office, was meant to kind of signal like, I want you to be out doing your job reporting. And that's, if you're in that area of work, I mean, I think the challenges are a little bit different, which also reminds me that, we're having a lot of discussions right now about what AI means for a journalist's work and, whether or not that's going to somehow, diminish reporting rigor. And, and I kind of make the comment, like, it's funny to me that we weren't having those same conversations about what the search engine meant to reporting rigor, because how often have we seen journalists reporting via Google? A lot of implications around that I think didn't get discussed the way we are around AI now. And I'm grateful we are having that conversation, but just kind of like a check. Hey, like these issues have always existed. And, it kind of all gets back to the umbrella of what's the nature of our work and what's the right way to be effective with it.
It must be a scary time to start out in journalism these days. I sometimes think about the fact that you're like every week you read about layoffs. Every week you read about, the political attacks against journalism in so many countries all over the world. You basically read about that uncertainty with AI. So I sometimes feel like, so you must be very brave to kind of start out in journalism these days. I sometimes think that when I meet journalism students or kind of young entrepreneurial folks who start their own thing.
I think that that's really true. I also think that in my work, I get to see a lot of the green shoots, the new nonprofit news outlets that are being launched across the United States. There is a meaningful increase in collaborative networks and news companies really coming together to talk more about, how do we make each other better? How do we agree on common standards? How do we, work better with academics or, whatever the case might be. And I'm heartened by that. And I think the definition and the opportunities that being a journalist, I think the meaning of that has changed. And, I think, so I don't know. I mean, that's kind of looking at glass half full, but, I think that there's a lot of excitement.
Absolutely.
So that also comes along with some of the despair around polarization and things like that.
And I do think, I mean, I'm always a glass half full person more than a glass half empty person. So I do feel there is also the opportunity to build a media ecosystem together now that's more collaborative, but also more equitable, and that really centers communities that haven't been centered before. And what I do see happening is that quite a few of these community-oriented startups that are being built, or collaboratives or new initiatives, whatever you might call them, are actually centering communities of color, are actually centering communities that have been underserved, are actually centering women in their coverage, but also representing that belief in their organizations and newsrooms. So I do hope that that like new wave that we just talked about is also going to influence legacy organization, that there is going to be kind of an influx back of, oh, wait, maybe we also have to change more radically than we did before.
I think that's right. And I think that underpinning that is a growing understanding that news organizations need to be positioning for impact. And you can see, I mean, that has been something that has really informed my own work, and or my understanding of that has really grown. If what you're trying to do is achieve impact, that leads to somewhat different decisions about the kind of work you do, how you structure your teams, how you engage with your audiences, whether it's local or national. And I feel like that is, in a way, one of the more exciting changes we see happening, that is very much leaving the realm of nonprofit news and starting to really inform, maybe traditional for-profit news outlets as well, where they are realizing that the path to success has to start with their impact on their audience and community.
Yeah.
And I think that's just a hugely positive development.
I totally agree. And what I do see is that sometimes legacy organizations, but also legacy managers and senior leaders, have a hard time with that shifting notion of impact, and have a hard time with the question of, well, if this is the new thing that we are optimizing for, how do we actually measure success, and how do we lead towards that impact? Have you seen that tension, or are you seeing that tension as well in the industry, and that shift of what leadership has to do in, that period of time?
Anita, as usual, you're asking 5 questions in the same. So I don't think that we as an industry have done a good job of documenting and measuring our impact and then telling the story of that. And I think we all are getting better and need to do even much more around that. And I will say that the act of having to report back to a foundation that has given you a grant to do something, there's nothing like that requirement to reinforce the importance of being able to measure impact and show it.
Yes.
And so we have, I can, speak for myself and AP, we have put some real work and resources into thinking about, developing an impact framework, and, kind of outlining and improving the tools we use to collect and document that. And I coincidentally just met yesterday with our news leaders to talk about how we start to move that kind of thinking and those tools beyond specifically the philanthropic funded journalism to the larger organization, and begin to imbue that throughout. So that's one thing. And that's a very positive change. And in a way, one follows the other, right? Like if suddenly you're involved in having to measure something, that then gets you as a news manager thinking more about, how do I do that, and how do I have something to show, and maybe I need to actually think about the strategies I'm using and around impact. And so, I think it all kind of goes together, but there's no question that this represents a different way of thinking about the work. And you can see that happening where we're having conversations about the fact that the number of people who viewed a story or downloaded a story is not the only measure of success of a story. So.
Yeah, I agree. So because you work with so many folks in your own organization, but also in other organizations, associations, and so forth, what are some traits that you're seeing in leaders in all kinds of organizations that you see emerge now, that you see prioritized now? What are some skills or approaches that you see in leadership that make working in this more interdisciplinary, collaborative environment more fruitful for everyone?
It feels sort of meta to say, well, they need to be collaborative to do collaborations. Yeah. But, I just think we can't stress enough that the skills and qualities that lead to ability to collaborate, are pretty critical in being able to operate in this new world. I mean, in my organization, but in many others, especially I think older organizations, I think there's this constant discussion about how do we de-silo the organization, and needing to break down those old walls between teams, between departments. And I think, people who are able to navigate that well and have an understanding of that to me, I'm seeing it more. And also I think we do need to develop those skills more when we are doing leadership development and management training and things like that, centering that in the work. So definitely that.
Yeah.
I would say, and I'm trying to think what else. I mean, I think that, I talked a little bit earlier about the importance of articulating the vision and helping people see the why, of what they're doing. I mean, I don't know that that's really a new thing, but I feel like there's just a little bit more emphasis today than maybe there has been in the past on really needing to zero in on the why are we doing this and why it matters and what's that North Star vision so that we all understand what we're working toward. I think more than ever, I'm feeling that there's an understanding of the importance of the discipline around that. I mean, partly by necessity, right? Because we can no longer afford as an industry to be just doing things for the sake of doing them.
Yeah.
We really be very intentional and ask hard questions about why we're doing what we're doing and the choices we're going to make.
And I think you're obviously you're saying these things, and to you and me now talking about it, they sound quite obvious, like collaboration, de-siloing, being able to very succinctly kind of explain the strategic goal of why we are doing what we're doing. But I do think traditionally the media industry as a whole has not been particularly great in either of those areas because it didn't have to be great in either of those areas. You could be, for many, many years, you could be a senior leader in an organization and not collaborate with folks outside of editorial, say. You could work in a total silo and be perceived as successful. You could be a super senior and perceived successful manager without being strategic and without kind of being able to share that strategic vision with others. So I do think you're saying a lot of very true things here that should be the standard, but for a long time they weren't the standard.
I think that's 100% right. And as you're talking about that, my mind kind of shifts to the piece of my hat that's the technology and news hat. As an industry, we've drastically underinvested in technology and data and helping even smaller newsrooms use very basic tools that make dramatic differences in their ability to produce great journalism. And when I talk to newsrooms about, AI and, when they're wondering, oh no, what do I need to do? And, realizing that there's just we're really starting from a very basic level in a lot of instances. And I mean, I think in a way, those two things are connected, leveraging collaborations or leveraging technology, which, both of which happen to have informed my own arc, to me, like it's all kind of part of the same thing that we're really needing to build a different kind of news industry.
Yeah. But it's not the traditional arc that many J schools prepare you for, or many internships that still kind of silo you into a corner of the newsroom, right? So I do think there is probably reinvention to be done there as well.
That's very true. And I feel like that's something you and I may even have talked about before, is that, students in journalism programs, it's not just about reporting or editing. It's also, who is training the next generation of collaboration editors or, leaders who can do that work.
Absolutely. Yeah. A lot of work to do here. Lisa, we're nearly at the end of our conversation, sadly. So I'd love to leave you with that last question that I ask all my guests at the end. If you could turn back time and go back to young Lisa at the very kind of early days of her career and give yourself some advice about careers, leadership, life, what would that advice be?
I think that my advice would be to take more chances and seek out new experiences earlier on. And don't be afraid that trying a slightly different role or moving to a slightly different kind of news organization, means something permanent about your career. That early on, that's the time where you're able to explore and build different kinds of muscles. And, you should take advantage of that. Young Lisa.
I love that. Wonderful advice, Lisa. And thank you so much for being here today.
Oh, thank you for having me. It was such an inspiring conversation.
Thanks, Lisa. This was today's episode of Better Leaders. If you enjoyed it, please do follow us and subscribe. Thanks for listening.
Missing Link